Unaware his wife was negotiating a multi-billion-dollar merger deal with his boss, he served her divorce papers in the kitchen, the office meeting that followed. He didn't just end his marriage in the kitchen, he humiliated it. On a quiet weekday morning, with no witnesses but cold countertops and an untouched cup of coffee, Daniel Carter slid a manila envelope across the kitchen island like it was an overdue utility bill. No real conversation, no real warning, just paper. He told himself this was control. He told himself this was clean. By the time the executive boardroom went silent, by the time his boss stopped looking at him as an asset, by the time the big merger meeting ended with his job already erased from every restructuring chart, Daniel still didn't understand how everything had gone so wrong. Because long before the office meeting, long before the whispers in the hallway, long before his public unraveling, he made his most careless decision at home. While his wife stood there reading every line without crying, while he mistook her silence for surrender, while he congratulated himself for being decisive, Daniel never once asked what she'd really been doing with her time. He never tracked the late nights she didn't explain, the calls taken in another room, the laptop he never saw her use in front of him, the documents she always put away before he walked in. He thought she was quiet because she was small. He thought her lack of drama meant dependence. He thought the real power in their house lived where he stood. What he didn't know, what he never bothered to suspect, was that the same woman he had just served divorce papers to in their kitchen was finalizing a multi-billion-dollar merger with the leadership team his boss answered to every morning, disclosed to the board, ring-fenced by lawyers, structured so carefully that even her own husband was walled off from the details. What followed for Daniel wasn't a screaming match. It wasn't begging. It wasn't movie-style revenge. It was an office meeting he wasn't prepared for. A room he thought he was finally important enough to sit in, a silence far more dangerous than anger. Because when the truth finally surfaced, when he saw who had actually been shaping the room he worshipped, it didn't just shock him, it ended him. Dear viewers, thanks for being here. If you're watching without subscribing, it's like watching someone's work in the background and assuming it doesn't matter. When you subscribe, you stand with everyone who was underestimated, dismissed, and betrayed, yet chose strategy, patience, and proof over noise instead of shouting at the wrong people. The envelope hit the counter with a sharp slap. Evelyn Carter didn't flinch, but the sound cut through the room like a warning shot. Daniel Carter stood on the other side of the kitchen island, suit already on, tie knotted too tight. 38. A rising mid-level executive at Helix Freight and Manufacturing. He wore the same expression he used in tense meetings, chin raised just a little higher than the situation required. In his head, this was a necessary pivot. In reality, he already had one foot out the door. Evelyn, 35, watched him. She wasn't frozen. She was taking inventory. She had learned years ago how to look smaller than she was, not because she lacked presence, but because powerful people revealed more when they thought you weren't a threat. Long before she was anyone's wife, she'd sat in rooms where the loudest voice lost first. Her father, a meticulous private investor, rarely said, "I love you," but he did say, "Read the contract again." He taught her to study deals before stories, to listen longer than she spoke, and to treat every signature like a loaded weapon. When he died, she didn't inherit a company. She inherited something rarer: access. Access to a discreet web of investors, board advisors, and corporate attorneys who preferred anonymity to applause. Through them, she stepped into work that suited her too well: quiet, high-stakes advisory roles, mergers, restructurings, risk mapping. Always through vehicles and entities that weren't in her married name. Often simply as Evelyn Brooks, the name on her birth certificate and on the old NDAs. By her late 20s, she could read a term sheet faster than most executives skimmed an email. She could point to the clause that would explode a year later, then build a structure where it never did. When Daniel met her, she had already chosen to step back from public-facing positions, not because she'd failed, because she'd done the math. Visibility came with limits. Invisibility came with freedom. Daniel never asked many follow-up questions. He liked that she didn't talk specifics about clients. He accepted the NDAs she mentioned as old work. He liked feeling like the one with the obvious career, so she let him. Now, in their kitchen, Daniel watched her like she was part of the house reliable infrastructure. The person who made sure there was food, that bills got paid, that his shirts came back from the cleaners on time. What he didn't notice was how her eyes moved. the micro-pause when he said, "This doesn't have to be complicated," the way his left hand tightened when he pushed the envelope forward. How the envelope itself sat just out of her easy reach, like a dare. "Evelyn," he said, clearing his throat, "you should read it." Her wedding ring caught the light as she rested her hand on the counter. Order mattered to her not because she was rigid, but because disorder exposed people before they were ready to speak. Daniel mistook her stillness for shock. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," he continued, voice careful, rehearsed. "This doesn't have to be complicated or ugly. We can do this like adults." She finally picked up the envelope. The law firm logo in the corner was one she recognized from industry gossip. Efficient, aggressive in negotiations, less impressive in subtle detail. The kind of place corporations use for quick fixes, not intricate strategy. She slid the papers out and read the way she always read something important, once for structure, once for where someone assumed she was naive. Generic clauses. Sloppy assumptions about her income. A proposed split that only made sense if she had no independent means and no access to good advice. He thought this was clean. In the background, a financial news channel muttered about corporate restructurings and minority control clauses. A graphic flashed across the screen with a headline that was technically wrong. Daniel scoffed, half listening. "They don't even understand how minority control clauses really work. They're protective, not decorative," Evelyn said automatically, eyes still on the wording about assets. He blinked. "Since when do you know that stuff?" "Since always," she said quietly. He laughed it off. "You've been watching too many documentaries." She let the moment pass. There was no point correcting his memory. He'd never chosen to store those details anyway. An hour later, he left for work convinced he had handled it. That night, long after his footsteps faded down the hall and his breathing evened into sleep, Evelyn stood alone in the small room he called storage. To him, it was junk. Old boxes, out-of-season clothes, a file cabinet he never opened. To her, it was containment. She moved a stack of photo albums, unlocked the bottom drawer, and pulled out a slim, matte laptop, hers, never shared, no stickers, no brand new shine, just a practiced kind of anonymity. Inside the drawer was also a plain folder, labeled only with a date from 18 months earlier and a code name, Project Northbridge. No company logo, no flashy branding. Just a thick non-disclosure agreement and the sparse notes she allowed herself to keep at home. She powered on the laptop. The screen glowed softly in the dark as she passed through two-factor authentication and a hardware key Daniel didn't even know existed. Merger dashboard status. 92% complete. Two logos appeared side by side. On the left, the holding group that had hired her as a confidential advisor. On the right, the blue and steel emblem she saw on Daniel's work badge every morning. Helix Freight and Manufacturing. Evelyn exhaled. Not in panic, not in relief, in control. When the holding group had retained her, she had disclosed everything. Her marriage, Daniel's employer, his title, his lack of decision-making authority at the levels that mattered for this deal. The board had documented her conflict of interest statement. Her role was limited to structure, value, and risk, not to individual employment outcomes or compensation tables. She was ring-fenced away from anything that touched Daniel personally. On paper, there was no conflict. In her kitchen, he had just made it intimate. She checked the latest notes, regulatory clearances, revised valuations, board meeting dates. The final integration briefing was locked in. She closed the laptop and stood in the stillness, listening to the muffled sound of Daniel turning in his sleep down the hall. Soon, she would say very little in a room that mattered far more than this kitchen. And the room where Daniel felt safest at work would no longer have a chair with his name on it. Years before the envelope, before Project Northbridge, before Lauren, the front door slammed hard enough that the frame rattled. Daniel stormed into the living room, tie loosened, face flushed with the kind of anger that comes from fear. "I'm done," he snapped, pacing. "They're setting me up to fail. The supplier pulled out and now it's all on me. They're saying I signed off on bad terms." His briefcase hit the floor. Papers slid out, printed contracts, decks, half-scribbled notes. His phone buzzed on the table. He ignored it, like the sound itself was an accusation. Evelyn looked up from the couch. Not startled, not annoyed. Present. This was the version of Daniel the office rarely saw, the one before he'd learned to perform competence. She shifted to the floor beside the scattered documents, crossing her legs. "What exactly are they blaming you for?" she asked. He rubbed his forehead. "The whole contract. They say I greenlit a risk that killed the project. If this sticks, I'm done." "What did you actually approve?" she asked, reaching for the top page. "Standard stuff," he said, defensive. "Everyone signs those internal approvals." Evelyn started reading. She always did the first pass silently. Clause by clause, she watched the architecture take shape. Risk pushed downward. Accountability blurred. Language that sounded harmless unless you knew where it diverted responsibility. She saw the trap in under a minute. "You didn't fail," she said. "You were positioned to absorb blame if anything went wrong." He stared. "How do you know that?" She hesitated. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because they'd never really laid out her world in his language. "I used to help build deals like this," she said. "This kind of wording doesn't happen by accident." They stayed on the floor until midnight, dissecting the contract. She flagged phrases that looked harmless but shifted liability. She drafted questions that forced clarity instead of emotion. She suggested emails he could send that didn't accuse anyone, but clearly documented what he'd actually approved. "Keep copies of everything," she said as she stacked the pages in order. "Emails, meeting notes, screenshots if you have to." "You worry too much," he said, trying to smile. "It's just work." To him, she was being supportive. To her, she was installing airbags. By the end of the week, Daniel still had his job. By the end of the month, people were calling him resilient under pressure. He told colleagues he'd fought for clarity. He never mentioned Evelyn. Someone did notice, though. A few months later, his mother, Margaret Carter, sat at their dining table while Daniel took a call in the bedroom. Evelyn was surrounded by neatly arranged piles of paper. "You're the reason my son stands upright," Margaret said, watching her. Evelyn looked up, startled. "I just organize things." Margaret shook her head. "No, he thinks strength is loud. You understand that it's quiet and prepared." Evelyn smiled politely, but inside she stored the observation away with everything else. Over the years, the pattern repeated. A crisis at work. Daniel came home with a stack of documents and a tight jaw. Evelyn read, translated, and turned chaos into a plan. Sometimes it was a supplier issue. Sometimes a compliance scare. Sometimes a manager trying to shift blame. Each time, she mapped who moved, which kind of risk where. She learned her husband's company like someone studying a system, not just sympathizing with a person. From Daniel's point of view, he had a wife who calmed him down and helped him think straight. From Evelyn's point of view, she could see clearly how quickly the same executives praising him would sacrifice him if a bigger deal required it. Much later, when he would sit in a bar with another woman telling him he was meant for more, he would feel newly understood. And Evelyn, quiet, watching, no longer cushioning every fall, would recognize the pattern instantly. The difference was that this time, she would not sprint ahead to catch him. She would simply step out from under where he insisted on standing. The first time Lauren Mills stepped into Daniel's space, it looked accidental. Outside the elevator on the 12th floor, she turned a corner too fast. They almost collided. Her hands shot out, fingers resting on his forearm, just long enough to steady herself and to hold his eyes. "Daniel, right?" she asked, like she already knew the answer. He nodded, thrown off more by her certainty than by the nearly dropped coffee. Lauren was 31, sharp angles and sharper timing. Her suits always looked a notch more considered than everyone else's. She worked in strategic development, 2 floors above him, close enough to executive decks to see outlines of big plans, far enough that she still had to prove she belonged. At first it was nothing. Compliments on his data slides, casual questions in cross-functional meetings. "We should grab coffee sometime," tossed over her shoulder as she left a conference room. At home, he mentioned her in passing. "Lauren from upstairs," he said one evening as he loosened his tie. "She's seriously sharp." Evelyn rinsed a mug. "Sharp people move things forward," she replied, then quieter. "They also cut." Daniel didn't notice the second part. He was already scrolling an email Lauren had just sent, praising a point he'd made in a meeting no one else had reacted to. Coffee chats turned into regular check-ins. "Where do you actually want to be in 5 years?" Lauren asked him once, notebook open, pen spinning between her fingers. "I don't know," he admitted. "Director, maybe. VP if I'm lucky. I've been doing the work, but I'm not in their rooms yet." "Exactly," she said. You're functioning above your pay grade without the title. That's their advantage, not yours. The sentence wrapped itself around his ego like a warm jacket. She dropped hints about things he hadn't heard about yet. There's something big moving, she said one afternoon, voice lower in the company cafe. Board's been meeting off-cycle. Strategy is uploading decks to restricted folders. This isn't just reforecasting. This is merger territory. Then why don't I know anything? He asked. She shrugged. Because they still see you as middle, useful, not critical. For now, dug into something restless inside him. Over the next months, their boundaries slid. Messages came later in the evening. Jokes edged personal. She remembered small things he'd said about feeling overlooked. Does your wife work? Lauren asked one night after a networking event as they lingered by the hotel bar. She does consulting, Daniel said. Old clients, private stuff. She's pretty low-key about it. So, she doesn't really get what it's like here, Lauren said, swirling her drink. The politics, the pressure. He hesitated, then nodded. Not like we do, no. Supportive, not ambitious. That was how he'd come to categorize Evelyn without realizing it. Support is nice, Lauren said. But ambition is electric. The word electric stayed with him all the way home. Evelyn felt the shift before he ever said Lauren's name again. She noticed the new cologne he didn't mention buying. The way he talked more about what I deserve and less about what I'm learning. The growing impatience when she answered his venting with structure instead of flattery. She didn't search his phone. She didn't interrogate. She did what she always did, observed. She also made a quiet adjustment of her own. She stopped volunteering strategies for his office politics. If he wanted to believe he was navigating alone now, she would let him test that belief. One evening, after too many drinks, Lauren leaned close enough that her perfume settled on his shirt. Men like you, she said, usually realize they built their lives around people who don't match their trajectory. He frowned. What's that supposed to mean? It means, she said, smiling, you're heading somewhere bigger, and not everyone you started with can go. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The idea followed him home and sat with him at the kitchen table the next morning while Evelyn poured his coffee and reminded him, gently, about a dentist appointment he'd forgotten. He looked at her then and, for the first time, wondered if quiet might actually mean small. He never once considered that the person he was mentally downgrading had already been in rooms far bigger than any Lauren had ever shadowed. They were still in the same quiet morning, the coffee still cooling on the counter, when the moment finally turned from shock into something she could measure. The envelope hit the kitchen counter for the second time in their marriage. The first had been a mortgage approval, hopeful, heavy, the day they decided this house was theirs. This time, the envelope was thinner. The weight came from what it ended, not from what it promised. Evelyn stood barefoot on the cool tile, her coffee going lukewarm beside the cutting board. The morning light came in at an angle, touching the ring on her finger, the stainless steel sink, the pale manila of the envelope. Daniel had chosen the kitchen on purpose, not the bedroom, where history might soften him, not the living room, where emotion had room to echo. The kitchen was practical, neutral, a place where things got done and cleaned away. He placed the papers next to the knife block and squared their edges like a spreadsheet column. I've already spoken to a lawyer, he said. This doesn't have to be ugly. The lawyer had been recommended by a senior colleague, someone Lauren knew, someone he wanted to impress. Fast, efficient, known for keeping messy divorces out of the office rumor mill. Evelyn held his gaze for a beat, then lowered her eyes to the envelope again. Her chest hurt. But the hurt wasn't surprise. It was the solid, familiar ache of finally seeing something in writing that she'd felt forming for months. She didn't grab the papers. She let the silence stretch just long enough to see what he did when no one rushed to fill it. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable. I just think this is better, he said, aiming for reasonable. We've grown in different directions. You're comfortable. I'm aiming higher. My life is changing. I need a partner who fits that. The word comfortable landed harder than he meant it to. You've been distant for months, he added quickly, as if building a case. You don't come to events anymore. You don't ask about the big moves happening at work. I need someone who wants that world with me. You stopped asking for my help when you found someone who flattered you, she thought. But she didn't say it. Instead, she picked up the envelope and slid the petition out. She read it the way she read every structure that could reshape a life. Slowly, then quickly, then slowly again. Assets, income assumptions, proposed timelines. Her consultancy was listed in a single line, described as minimal irregular income. Her father's estate appeared as vague family background, not as the properly documented, ring-fenced investment portfolio it actually was. The document was built on a premise that she had always been a supporting character in Daniel's story, not someone with her own. He misread her silence as emotional shock. "I know this is sudden," he went on, "but we can make this smooth. No one at work even has to know the details." She lifted her eyes. "Who told you this was a good idea?" she asked calmly. "And that I'd just sign?" He faltered for a fraction of a second, long enough for her to see Lauren's shadow move across his face. "It's my decision," he said finally. "I don't need anyone's permission." Evelyn turned to the last page and read every line. No mention of any serious spousal support, because he'd framed her as someone who could get a job if she wanted. No acknowledgement of the unpaid work she'd done that had directly saved his career more than once. She set the papers flat on the counter, aligning them with the edge. "You're not going to say anything?" he demanded. "After everything? I heard you," she replied. "That's it?" Her voice stayed steady. "This is a legal document, Daniel, not a conversation. You've already had the conversation with whoever helped you write this." His jaw clenched. "I want this clean," he repeated, as if the word itself were a shield. "Then send me your lawyer's details," she said. "And copies of anything he used to make assumptions about me. I'll respond through counsel." "Why do you need to make it so formal?" he asked, irritation edging in. "Because it is formal," she said. "You made it formal when you turned our marriage into something you served with a logo in the corner." For the first time since he placed the envelope down, he seemed unsure. He grabbed his keys. "I'll email you his contact," he said, retreating toward the door. "I have a 9:30. "Daniel," she said. He stopped, hand on the handle. "You should be careful who you let advise you," she added. "Not everyone standing next to you is invested in what happens to you 3 steps after this." He scoffed. "You don't understand my world anymore." The door closed a little harder than necessary. Evelyn stayed where she was, listening to the quiet that followed. Then she turned the envelope over and traced the law firm's logo with her thumb, mentally cataloging the small tells, the rushed drafting, the missing nuance. He had walked into a process she understood far better than he did. He just didn't know it. For the first time that morning, her expression changed. It wasn't relief. It wasn't vindictive. It was resolve. The kitchen was no longer just the place where decisions arrived. It was where she would decide, very carefully, how everything moved next. The echo of the slammed door faded. The house went still. Evelyn didn't move for a long moment. She stood with her hands on either side of the divorce papers, wedding ring cool against her skin. Then quietly she slid the ring off. A pale band remained on her finger. A faint circle of years lived in good faith. She placed the ring beside the envelope, lining it up with the edge of the paper. The silence around her no longer felt like something being done to her. It felt like available space. She picked up her phone and scrolled to a number she hadn't used in months, but had never deleted. Marcus Levin. A calm voice answered after the second ring. "It's Evelyn," she said. He filed. Marcus didn't ask who he was. He knew. He'd met Daniel once at a charity event years ago, when Evelyn had introduced him as an old colleague of my father's. He'd watched enough corporate divorces, personal and professional, to read the rest. "Are you safe?" he asked first. "Yes," she said. "I'm fine. I'm informed." A brief pause, then his tone shifted into the professional lane they both understood. "I've seen the petition," he said. "His counsel filed it electronically this morning. It's exactly what I'd expect from that firm, confident in tone, thin in substance. We can dismantle it in a week if you want to go aggressive." "I don't," she said. "I want it accurate, clean, no spectacle. I'm not interested in punishing him. Then we'll correct the assumptions about your income, protect your share of the house and the estate, and keep it out of any venue that invites attention," Marcus replied. "We'll treat it like any other uneven deal." "Good," she said. He hesitated. "And Northbridge?" There it was, the other axis of her life. "The board wants signatures inside 48 hours, he continued. "Regulators are cleared. The structure is locked unless someone has a serious last-minute objection." "We proceed as planned," she said. "Ring fencing stays intact." I don't want any suggestion that my divorce influenced the deal terms. It doesn't, he said. His role is mid-tier. You've been excluded from all individual employment decisions. That's in writing. She nodded, even though he couldn't see it. I want one update, she added. I'm listening, Marcus said. For the final integration briefing, she said, I want an operations representative at Daniel's level in the room as an observer. Someone who sits where the impact is felt, not just in the C-suite. That's already in the plan, Marcus said. We suggested one to Richard's office. HR is proposing your husband, given his current title. We flagged the relationship in the file and noted you're recused from any decision about his employment. The board accepted the arrangement. So he'll be invited, she said. Yes, Marcus replied. To listen, not to negotiate. Good, she said quietly. He deserves to hear how the company he trusted actually works, from the people who run it. And in the divorce? Marcus asked. Do you want me to send his counsel an early warning about how the merger might affect his income? It changes the numbers. Evelyn looked at the petition again, at the way he'd framed her as dependent, at the timing he'd chosen, clearly believing he was stepping into a bigger version of himself. No, she said. We'll disclose what's required, but we won't pre-argue his career for him. That part is his responsibility. They confirmed next steps. He'd send her a clean summary of the petition. She'd sign a limited power of attorney for filings. They'd finalize a response after the board meeting, not before. When she hung up, the house no longer felt like a stage where things happened to her. It felt like a place where she was back in control of the script. She walked down the hall to the small storage room, shut the door, and opened the locked drawer again. The laptop woke to her touch. Login approved Project Northbridge merger progress. 92% complete next milestone. Executive board and integration, briefing 2 days. She opened the attendee overview Marcus had mentioned. Board members, senior executives, external counsel, strategic development. At the bottom, operations representative, observer. Daniel Carter, regional lead conflict disclosure. Spouse, Evelyn Brooks, engaged as external advisor. Ring fencing, confirmed. Evelyn stared at his name for a moment. Once, she would have quietly worked to protect his position, maybe pushed for a carve-out, an exception, a transitional role. She knew how to do that. It would have been easy, structurally. Now she closed the document without changing a word. His division was bloated. The model worked better without that layer. That was objective reality, not personal judgment. He had chosen to turn their marriage into an item on a legal docket. She was choosing to stop bending the rest of her life around his blind spots. She powered down the laptop, returned it to the drawer, and locked it. Back in the kitchen, she slid the divorce papers into a folder of her own, not to hide them, but to file them in the right category. One process among many, not the center of her existence. Somewhere across town, Daniel sat in a bar, rehearsing the story he'd tell. How he was finally taking charge, how his life was about to level up, how a big move at work might finally prove everyone had underestimated him. He thought this was the day he took control. Evelyn rinsed her cold coffee down the sink, washed the mug, and set it upside down to dry. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't standing behind him, patching the cracks in his story. She was standing on her own side of the table, ready for a boardroom he didn't even know she had built. Daniel Carter laughed as the revolving doors of Helix Freight and Manufacturing spun him out onto the street. The sound startled even him too loud, too sharp for the tightness in his chest, but it made a good story in his head. A man finally shaking off the weight of a marriage that didn't fit anymore. Divorce papers served, hard part done, trajectory fixed. That was the story he chose. He checked his reflection in the lobby glass, a mid-level operations lead in a well-cut suit, 38, ambitious, with just enough tired around the eyes to signal he'd put in the years. He straightened his tie and turned toward the bar across the street. Lauren Mills was already inside. She sat in a booth near the back, where the noise from the TVs turned into a comfortable hum. Her phone lay face down beside her drink, a small signal he'd learned to interpret as, "You have my attention for now." When he slid into the seat opposite, she studied his face before speaking. "So," she said, raising her glass slightly. "You did it?" "Yeah," he exhaled, forcing a smile. "I served her this morning." "How'd she take it?" Lauren asked. "Casual, but watching closely." "Better than I expected," he said. Too well, actually. No crying, no yelling. She just read the papers. He tried to make it sound like a criticism, but underneath there was something like unease. Lauren's mouth twitched. People freeze when they lose the thing that made them feel secure, she said. She'll probably fall apart later. He nodded, letting himself accept that version. It was cleaner than the truth that he had no idea what she would do. She changed gears smoothly. Anyway, she said, you picked an interesting week for major life changes. Things are moving up there. She tilted her head toward the floors above his. Fast, Daniel frowned. Fast how? There's a session on the top floor in 2 days, she said. Not the usual quarterly check-in. Executive level, restricted decks, off-cycle board calls. It smells like a merger. The word sent a jolt through him. Are you sure? He asked. Rumors start every time someone from the parent group flies in. I don't deal in rumors, Lauren said. I see calendars. I see who's booked in which rooms, which folders get restricted, which decks have Northbridge in the file name and disappear into encrypted channels. He blinked. Northbridge? She smirked. Internal code name. You didn't hear it from me. He tried to hide the sting. I haven't heard a thing, he admitted. Apparently my level doesn't warrant that kind of visibility. For the moment, she said. He took a drink, the burn flattening some of his frustration. You're the one they rely on when logistics go sideways, Lauren continued. I see your name all over project email chains. You're functioning like senior staff without the senior invite list. That's their advantage, not yours. Her words wrapped around the bruised part of his ego, warm and validating. So why tell me? He asked. You don't get points for giving me a heads up. I like working with people who could keep up in bigger rooms, she said. If this merger is what I think it is, there are going to be new chairs at new tables. Someone should make sure your name isn't forgotten. Her phone lit up for a second, then dimmed. Reflexively, she flipped it over, glanced once, then put it face down again. Her posture shifted, more alert, more focused. Speaking of, she said, finishing her drink, I need to prep for tomorrow. Strategies knee-deep in models and what-ifs. Am I going to be told what's going on at some point? He asked, half joking, half serious. If I can help it, she said, touching his shoulder lightly as she slid out of the booth. You won't be the last to know. She kissed his cheek quickly soft, practiced, and was gone before he could respond. For a moment, he sat there feeling buoyant. Divorce in motion, a possibly huge merger on the horizon. A woman in strategy who thought he was being underused. It all felt like momentum. By the time he got home, the bar's warmth had faded. The house felt wrong, too quiet, too neat, but he told himself that was temporary. He dropped onto the couch, opened his work email, and checked his calendar. Nothing. No Project Northbridge. No executive session confidential. Just regular status meetings and a reminder about a performance check-in. He refreshed. Nothing. Somewhere in a different office a few blocks away, his name was already attached to an attendee line as operations representative observer, flagged with a conflict disclosure Evelyn had filed months before. He assumed Lauren would have to nudge someone to get him into that room. He never considered that the person who had made sure his role would be represented there without altering a single fair process was the same woman he'd told that morning she no longer fit the life he was moving into. 2 blocks from Helix's main building, high above the street, the conference room in the holding group's office was quiet enough to make every page turn sound deliberate. Evelyn sat at the rectangular table, a legal pad in front of her, pen uncapped but idle. Across from her, Marcus Levin set a printout on the table and slid it toward her. That, he said, is the petition Daniel's lawyer filed this morning. I pulled it from the court docket. Evelyn glanced at the header, the same firm logo she'd seen on the envelope at her kitchen counter, then scanned the first page. It's as we expected, Marcus went on. Overconfident in tone, underdeveloped in detail. Income assumptions about you are wrong by a wide margin. Property division is skewed. Nothing we can't fix. I don't want a spectacle, Evelyn said. No aggressive filings, no threats, just corrections. Marcus nodded. We'll restate your income accurately, protect your share of the house, and clarify the treatment of your father's estate. No press, no courtroom theatrics. I'll draft a clean, firm response and send it for your review after the board meeting. Naomi Reed, senior advisor for the holding group, slid her tablet into the space between them. Speaking of the board meeting, she said, tapping the screen. This is where we are on Project Northbridge. A familiar dashboard lit up timelines, charts, ownership structures. Regulatory approvals are cleared, Naomi said. All conditions precedent are satisfied. The only remaining step is execution at Helix's side and confirmation of the integration plan. She swiped to a page outlining the post-merger organization. The new operations structure removes the mid-level regional management tier, she said. You can see here, she zoomed. This layer has been absorbing responsibility without having real strategic authority. We've preserved frontline supervision and senior oversight. The middle tier is being collapsed. Evelyn's eyes took in the boxes and lines. One of those boxes was where Daniel currently sat. Is the cut justified beyond short-term cost savings? She asked. Naomi nodded. Yes. The models run cleaner and more flexible without that tier. And we're not zeroing out the people without support. Severance is above median. There's a redeployment matrix for high-skill roles. It's firm, but it's not reckless. Marcus folded his hands. HR at Helix has the list of affected positions, he said. Your husband's role is on it. Our conflict file notes that you've been recused from any decisions touching individual employees, including him. Good, Evelyn said quietly. Keep that record tight. I don't want anything blurring that line. Naomi slid to the attendee list for the final briefing at Helix headquarters. There's your side, she said, indicating the holding group's column. And here, she pointed to the other column, are Helix's attendees, board, executives, strategy, HR, operations representative, observer level, Daniel Carter. HR proposed him last month. Richard approved. Evelyn saw his name, exactly where she'd seen it on her laptop the night before. Conflict disclosure attached, Naomi added. We confirmed your ring fencing. The board is comfortable with him in the room as an observer. He won't be speaking into structural decisions. So he'll hear the plan at the same time as everyone else on that floor, Evelyn said. Yes, Marcus replied. In real time. No surprises after the fact beyond the ones he's already chosen for himself. Evelyn sat back. Once, she might have argued for a softer landing just for him. An extra conversation, a private warning. Now, she was careful. The structure works? She asked again. If I weren't married to him, would I still recommend this design? Yes, Naomi said. We'd likely be where we are now, with or without Daniel Carter. Then we don't distort it, Evelyn said. We keep it fair. We keep it documented, and we let Helix handle its people according to the plan they agreed to. Marcus made a note. We'll finalize the integration briefing materials today, Naomi said. Board meeting tomorrow, 10 a.m., at Helix HQ. Execution copies will be ready. Once signed, the transaction is effectively irreversible without significant damage. Evelyn nodded. File our divorce response after that, she told Marcus. I don't want anyone suggesting we timed anything around his employment status. We won't, he said. Your timelines were set months before he made his move. The paper trail shows that. They stood. Naomi hesitated as they walked toward the elevator. Are you sure you don't want something more formal out of this? She asked. A public-facing title, maybe. Once Helix sees how smoothly this goes, they'll ask who you are. They already know who I am where it matters, Evelyn said. If a title gives me more leverage on the next deal, I'll take it. I don't need my face in their press release. Naomi smiled faintly. You are the only person I know who can move a multi-billion-dollar deal and still worry about being too visible. Visible people make easy targets, Evelyn replied. The elevator doors opened. In less than 24 hours, she would step into a boardroom Daniel had only ever seen from the outside. He'd walk into that same room convinced someone new had finally pulled him in. He still didn't realize the structure he wanted so badly to belong to was one she had been quietly shaping long before he decided she no longer fit his idea of ambition. Daniel stared at his phone all morning, as if looking at the screen hard enough would make the notification appear. At 9:12 a.m., it did. New event. Project Northbridge Executive Session, confidential location. Helix HQ, 18th floor boardroom attendees. Board, CEO, CFO, Strategic Development, HR. Near the bottom, Daniel Carter, Operations Observer. His heart kicked. A second message followed almost immediately, an internal note from his director. Daniel, you've been added as Operations Representative Observer for today's Northbridge briefing. Listen, take notes, and keep this confidential until comms go out. M. He read it twice, then opened his messages. Lauren had texted late the previous night, after he'd complained he was being kept in the dark. You're right. It's ridiculous you aren't looped in. I'll nudge where I can. Watch your inbox tomorrow. He looked from her message to the invite and decided the cause and effect was obvious. Of course she'd pushed someone. Of course she'd made this happen. That was the kind of ally he'd been needing. He adjusted his tie in the restroom mirror, straightened his shoulders, and made his way up to the top floor, first by elevator, then through a set of glass doors he'd only ever passed as part of a larger crowd. The 18th floor boardroom felt like another company entirely. Floor-to-ceiling windows, heavy table, art that never made it to the lower levels. People here didn't carry laptops the way they did on his floor. They carried decisions. He slipped into a chair along the wall. In the row of observers, mid-tier managers, a couple of specialists from strategy, someone from legal. Lauren sat at the table itself, a few seats down from the CFO, notebook open, expression focused. She looked back just long enough to give him a small, quick smile, then turned toward the head of the table as if she'd been there all along. Good morning, said Richard Hale, Helix's CEO, from his seat at the end of the table. The room quieted almost instantly. We'll begin as soon as our external lead advisor arrives. External. Daniel had assumed this would be mostly Richard and the CFO talking through slides. Maybe someone from the parent company dialed in. The door opened. For a second, Daniel's brain refused to make sense of what his eyes saw. Evelyn walked in, not in jeans and a soft sweater, not barefoot in their kitchen, but in a dark, tailored suit he didn't recognize, hair pulled back cleanly, a slim folio in her hand. A visitor badge clipped at her waist read, E. Brooks, Strategic Advisor, External, Brooks, her maiden name. She didn't look at him. Richard stood enough to acknowledge her. Thank you for joining us, Miss Brooks, he said, and for your work getting us to this stage. Of course, Evelyn replied, taking the seat beside him, with the familiarity of someone who'd been in that room many times before. Her voice was the same one that had asked him if he wanted more coffee that morning he'd decided to end their marriage. The context was completely different. Daniel's pulse roared in his ears. Lauren's pen hovered over her notebook. She went perfectly still. Richard gestured toward Evelyn. If you'll walk us through the final structure, he said. Evelyn opened her folio. The purpose of today's session, she began, is to confirm execution of the Northbridge transaction and review the integration structure on Helix's side, with a focus on operations, risk, and long-term positioning. Her tone was measured, calm. This was not a woman improvising. This was someone presenting architecture she had helped design. She moved through key points with ease. Regulatory approvals, greenlit, purchase price and consideration mix, aligned with prior board resolutions. Post-merger structure, leaner, clearer reporting lines, risk distribution, balance between Helix and the holding group. Board members interrupted with questions. Some of them were the type of questions that could expose a weak advisor. She answered with page numbers, references to prior memos, and alternative scenarios they'd already stress-tested. No one in the room looked surprised to see her doing this, except him. On the far wall, a slide showed Helix's current operational hierarchy. Then the post-merger version. Boxes disappeared in the middle. Lines redrew. Evelyn tapped the screen. As discussed in previous sessions, she said, the mid-level regional operations tier is being removed. Responsibilities are redistributed upward to strategic leads and downward to frontline supervisors. This reduces decision drag and clarifies accountability. Daniel's eyes traced the before and after diagrams. His box wasn't there in the after. Lauren shifted, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Richard picked up from there. Certain positions in operations will not map forward, he said. HR will manage individual conversations and transitions. Today is about structure and strategic fit. To most people in that room, positions meant anonymous roles. To Daniel, it was personal. He stared at Evelyn. The woman he'd served papers to in their kitchen was now calmly explaining why the layer he sat in no longer belonged in the company's future. And the worst part was that no one else seemed to think this was strange. The room's energy changed when the final set of documents was placed at the center of the table. It wasn't dramatic, just an almost physical awareness that everything up to this point had been preamble. Richard rested a hand on the folder. "If there are no further questions on structure or risk," he said, "we'll proceed to execution." A board member cleared her throat. "Just one," she said. "Are we comfortable we've handled the people side responsibly, particularly in operations?" Evelyn answered before Richard could. "The redundancy is structural, not personal," she said. "We've benchmarked severance above industry median. HR has a redeployment matrix for roles with transferable skills. We've been explicit in all internal documentation that this is about eliminating a dysfunctional layer, not punishing individuals." She flipped to a back page and tapped it lightly. "Mid-level regional operations was absorbing accountability without clear authority," she added. "That's bad design. This corrects it." Daniel felt the words land in his chest. "That's my layer." He felt his chair scrape against the floor before he realized he'd stood up. "Excuse me," he said. Every head turned. "This redundant layer you're talking about," he said, gesturing toward the slide. "That's me. That's my team. I've led operations across 3 regional crises in the last 5 years. You're just deleting us from a chart?" A few executives shifted uncomfortably. Observers along the wall stared at the table, suddenly fascinated by their notes. "Mr. Carter," Richard said, voice even, "this session is about strategic structure. Individual employment conversations will take place with human resources." Daniel ignored him. He looked at Evelyn. "You knew," he said. "While I was coming home exhausted, telling you about backlog and route failures, you were working on this. While I was serving you papers, you already knew my role was on the chopping block." Evelyn met his eyes for the first time since entering the room. "I disclosed our relationship when I was engaged," she said. "I've been recused from decisions about individual outcomes. I did not put your name on any list. I worked on the structure, not on you." "That's convenient," he snapped. "You're the one with the pen in your hand." Her gaze didn't waver. "No," she said quietly. "I'm the one who made sure this structure was fair, not painless. Fair. With or without you in that box, this is the model Helix needed. Your role didn't vanish because you were you," she added. "It vanished because the layer itself was bad design." He let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "I should have been involved," he said. "I know this operation better than anyone here. I've been doing the work for years. I find out now, in a room where I don't even have a vote, you were never part of this negotiation." She replied not cruelly, but plainly. "Not because you aren't capable in your lane, but because this table isn't about middle management. It's about ownership and direction. That's the level this conversation sits at." The sentence landed with more weight than any insult would have. Richard cleared his throat. "Daniel," he said, using his first name now, "I understand this feels personal, but this isn't the venue. HR will meet with you after this session. You'll be treated fairly. Please, take your seat." Daniel looked around the room. No one looked back directly. Not Lauren, who was now studying her notebook like it could shield her from being associated with him. Not his director, who stared straight ahead. For the first time, Daniel felt how very small his chair at the edge of the room really was. He sat down. Richard opened the folder. "Helix Freight and Manufacturing. Northbridge Transaction Execution Copy," he read. He signed on the designated line, then slid the folder to the next board member. One by one, pens scratched across paper. When the folder reached Evelyn, she picked up her pen. Her hand was steady. She signed, Evelyn Brooks, the name he hadn't heard in years, the name on all the NDAs he'd never asked about. The line she signed on made the merger binding, the new structure real, and his redundancy more than a rumor in a hallway. When the last signature was in place, Richard closed the folder with a soft thud. "It's done," he said. He turned to Evelyn. "On behalf of the board, thank you," he added. "Your work on Northbridge has been exemplary. We look forward to continuing the relationship on integration." "Thank you," she said. Chairs slid back. Side conversations started. People filed out, already talking about communication plans, press statements, and integration teams. Lauren gathered her notebook quickly. She didn't touch his arm. She didn't say, "I'll fix this." She didn't even meet his eyes. She slipped out with a small nod to someone from strategy and was gone. Richard paused by Daniel's chair. HR will reach out within the hour, he said. You'll be offered a competitive severance and support. Take what you've built here and use it well. This is about where the company needed to go, not about you as a person. Then he walked away. The boardroom emptied. Daniel stayed seated. He stared at the space Evelyn's chair had occupied, the neat folder that was now tucked under the arm of someone from legal. The divorce papers in his kitchen were just one kind of signature. This was another. He realized, slowly and painfully, that he wasn't being cut out in a single, dramatic moment. He'd been moving toward this for a long time, through every contract he never bothered to understand, every structure he assumed someone else would explain, every time he'd preferred validation over truth, and the person who had understood how all of it actually worked was the same one he decided he'd outgrown. Weeks later, the knock on the apartment door was short and impersonal. Daniel paused halfway to the kettle. The one bedroom still smelled like fresh paint and cardboard. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a waiting room. Another knock. He opened the door. A courier stood there with a tablet and a thin envelope. Signature, please, Daniel signed. The courier handed him the envelope and left without small talk. He closed the door and looked at the return address. Family court, case number he recognized. He opened it. Final decree of divorce. No drama. No embossed flair. Just paper and stamps, documenting in precise legal language what had already been true in practice. He dropped it on the coffee table and sat down. His phone buzzed beside him, screen lighting up with a calendar reminder from days earlier. Transition meeting human resources. He'd already had it. Neutral conference room. HR representative. A manager from 2 levels up sitting stiffly, reading from a script. We appreciate your contributions, Daniel, they'd said. Under the Northbridge integration, your position is being made redundant. This isn't about your performance. It's about the new structure. He'd nodded like it was happening to someone else. They'd outlined his options. Severance package, outplacement services, a list of roles in other regions he could apply for, none at his previous level. On the way back to his floor, security met him outside the glass doors, not hostile, just present, holding a cardboard box. Company policy, his manager had murmured. We'll give you time to pack personal items. Your system access will end when you leave the floor. He remembered the quiet humiliation of dropping framed photos, a mug, and a plant into the box while people pretended not to watch. He'd ridden the elevator down for the last time, as an employee, badge already deactivated. His phone had buzzed then too. From Lauren, I heard. I'm sorry. Things move faster than I thought. It's complicated. He hadn't replied. Now, in the cramped living room, the divorce decree sat beside his phone, the personal and professional endings lying a few inches apart. Same year, same merger, same blind spots. Days later, he saw Evelyn again. Not at their house legally hers now. Not at Helix, his badge no longer opened those doors. In a neutral office downtown, in a conference room Marcus had chosen precisely because it was boring. Marcus ran through the final points in 15 minutes. Property transfers are complete, he said. Accounts updated. The decree is entered. Today is just to confirm signatures and close the loop on documentation. He looked from one to the other. You're both legally clear of each other now, he said. Whatever you say in this room is personal, not procedural. He packed his briefcase and stepped out, giving them a privacy he didn't often see in his usual work. Evelyn stood by the window, looking down at the city. When she turned, Daniel saw the familiar and unfamiliar at once. Same face, different posture. Evelyn, he said. She waited. On the ride over, he'd rehearsed speeches, apologies, accusations, cheap attempts at humor. None of them survived contact with the actual moment. I didn't know who you were, he said finally. Not really. I thought you were just quiet, just supportive, just there. The word just tasted wrong now. I was wrong, he said. She nodded once. I know. I lost the job, he added, as if she might not have heard. I know, she said again. HR had to confirm your status as part of the conflict file. He winced. Did you do this to me? It was a childish question, but an honest one. No, she said. Northbridge was moving long before you served those papers. The structure would have looked the same whether you were in operations or not. I didn't design this around you. She held his gaze. I just refused to bend it to save you, she finished. That's the difference. He swallowed. That boardroom, he said. You walking in like that. Everyone acting like you belong there, that you'd always belong there. How long have you been doing this? Longer than we've been married, she replied. You liked that I didn't drag work home. You never really asked what consulting meant beyond that. He thought of every night he dropped contracts in front of her and let her untangle the mess, then walked into work acting like the clarity had come from nowhere. I did know who you were, she added quietly. I knew your strengths, your blind spots, the way you loved validation more than information when you were scared. I chose to love you anyway, for a long time. The difference between I didn't know and I did know hung heavy between them. No one was here to referee, no court reporter, no HR rep. Just two people standing in the aftermath of choices they'd both made. Take care of yourself, Daniel, she said, gathering her folder. There was no anger in it, no invitation either. She walked past him and left the room. The door clicked shut, soft but final. For the first time since this started, he understood there was no one left to translate consequences into softer versions for him. That night, Evelyn stood alone in the kitchen of the house that was now legally hers. The counter was clear. No envelope, no ring, no unsigned papers waiting. The room felt smaller without someone else's expectations in it, and somehow more honest. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A new email preview slid across the screen. Subject: Appointment confirmed. Strategic Integration Advisor effective. Immediately, the holding group had given her a formal title for work she'd already been doing in the shadows, overseeing integration across a portfolio of companies like Helix. Mostly behind closed doors, mostly under her maiden name. She opened the email, read the brief details, and set the phone down. No celebratory dance. No dramatic monologue, just a quiet recognition that nothing about this position depended on anyone underestimating her. She turned off the kitchen light. As she walked down the hallway, she remembered Margaret's words years ago. You're the reason my son stands upright. Maybe that had been true then. Now she understood something else. It doesn't matter how long you hold someone upright if they keep insisting the ground beneath them doesn't matter. She sat on the edge of her bed, the house silent around her, an integration schedule and a new life waiting on tomorrow's calendar. Some people think power is loud. They think it's the person doing all the talking in the room. But the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate the quiet person who loved you, who learned exactly how that room works, and who finally stepped out of the job of protecting you from it. The screen fades to black. And if you're still watching, the storyteller's voice returns. Don't forget, watching someone's work in the background and assuming it doesn't matter is exactly how people like Daniel lose everything. Like, share, and comment the lesson that hit you the hardest. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments below, and I'll see you in my next video.